And we're ready to get started. Thanks to everybody for joining today for this very interesting discussion on a topic that we often think about, but have not really discussed in great details. So my name is Yun Sun. I'm the director of the China program and the co-director of the East Asia program here at the Stimson Center. As you can tell, we primarily focus on China, China's foreign policy, China's relationship with the rest of the world. And the topic today that we're trying to cover is China's relationship with Paris Club. And the discussion is based on a very interesting policy paper that our non-resident fellow, Lex Rifle, has just completed, titled Normalizing China's Relationship with the Paris Club. We all know that the COVID-19 pandemic has strained low-income countries as they service their external debts and leaving them to turn to different creditors for relief. China has been a significant lender in this picture, but itself is not a member of Paris Club and has dealt with countries struggling to meet debt obligations differently. Well, to note that China is indeed a member of the G20 initiative, the DSSI. So China has agreed to provide debt suspension and some relief, and in most cases on a bilateral level, renegotiated and restructured debt packages with countries, especially low-income countries that owe China a substantial amount of foreign debt. So what is the relationship between China and the Paris Club in this case? Because it does beg the question that if China is a significant lender in the picture and China follows a different set of rules, so what are the implications for the countries that are affected by these arrangements? So to discuss these issues, we have two excellent experts today to share with us their observations. They both have decades and decades of experience working on international development and also observing China's behavior in this field of international development and foreign aid. So to begin with, we have Lex Rifle, who is our non-resident fellow here at the Stimson Center. He has had a lifetime of career on international development and especially international finance, and has been particularly well informed on the issue of Paris Club because of his involvement with institutions such as with IFI, Institute of International Finance, and with Brookings Institution, and with the U.S. Treasury Department. Then to share with us his observation and his comments of Lex paper, we have Dr. Scott Morris, who is the director of the U.S. Development Policy Initiative, co-director of Sustainable Development Finance, and senior fellow of the Center for Global Development. Scott has been focusing and studying China's foreign aid and international development policies for quite a while, and Center for Global Development has done some terrific research in this regard, and I really recommend that you visit the website of the CGD to look into some of their research on this topic as well. So your questions and comments are welcomed throughout the session. You don't have to wait till the Q&A session to pose your question. You can just pose a question in the Q&A box on the Zoom link as they arise. So without further ado, I will hand over the screen to Lex. Lex, please tell us what your paper has examined and what your primary conclusions are regarding China's relationship with Paris Club. Thank you, Lex. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Yun, for your kind introduction. I thought I should start by giving listeners a sense of where I'm coming from. I joined the Treasury Department in 1975, and 2 years later, I became the Paris Club desk officer. I remained in that position for 7 years, and during that period, there were two significant events in the business of sovereign debt restructuring. First, in the context of a default by the country of Zaire, now Congo Congo something. Commercial banks that had made substantial loans to the government were not getting paid and wanted their home governments to bail them out. In the Paris Club, we established the so-called comparable treatment principle, which is that commercial creditors must reschedule payments owed to them on essentially the same terms as payments owed to the government agencies in countries that are members of the Paris Club. The second event happened in the context of the so-called North-South dialogue taking place under the auspices of the United Nations. The countries of the South were calling for generalized debt relief for all developing countries experiencing debt servicing difficulties. The creditor countries of the North successfully fought against this campaign for what they called debt relief on demand. And in the process, we codified the basic principles of the Paris Club, all of which remain today, I would argue. I had other jobs with the Treasury Department between 1984 and 1994 that were not focused on sovereign debt restructuring, but touched on it in various ways. For example, in 1988-89, I was working in the office of the US Executive Director at the IMF when the Brady Plan was launched to bring an end to the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s. And this was a big move in the direction of debt reduction. In 1994, I left the Treasury to join the Institute of International Finance. The IIF is the leading industry association for the global financial industry. Members include the biggest banks in both developing and industrial countries. My job at the IIF took a sharp turn toward sovereign debt restructuring in the wake of the Mexican peso crisis in 1995. And for the next 6 years, my small team at the IIF focused on crisis prevention and crisis resolution, both of which directly related to sovereign debt restructuring as it affects commercial lenders, private sector lenders. During this period, serious work was done in connection with the Asian financial crisis in 1997-98, the Russian default in 1998, and Argentina's historic bond default in 2001. I left the IIF in 2001 and a year later joined the Brookings Institution to write a book on the sovereign debt restructuring process, starting with the establishment of the Paris Club in 1956 and describing the evolution of the process from debt rescheduling to debt reduction to the knotty problem of restructuring bonds floated in the international capital market. It was this knotty problem that my book was aimed at. Specifically, the IMF Deputy Managing Director at the time, the American economist Ann Kruger, had floated a proposal to solve this problem in 2001 by creating what she called the Sovereign Debt Restructuring Mechanism. This was an IMF-centered approach that I believed then and still believe would not be in the best interest of public sector creditors or private sector creditors or borrowing countries. The title of my book, published by the Brookings Institution Press in 2003, is Sovereign Debt Restructuring, the Case for Ad Hoc Machinery. The ad hoc machinery described in the book is the Paris Club process. I've been told that my book remains the best treatment of the role of the Paris Club and the basic principles at work in all restructuring cases since then. From 2003 until the end of 2020, I did very little work in the area of sovereign debt restructuring. What drew me back into this area is the COVID-19 pandemic, and especially its impact on low-income developing countries. In a nutshell, the impact has been so severe that as of a month ago, 37 countries had requested suspension of their debt service payments to official agencies in Paris Club member countries. Before the pandemic dust settles, not this year, hopefully next year, so before the dust settles, it's quite possible that twice as many countries, we could have 60, 70, 80 countries, have to benefit from debt reduction in some kind of Paris Club type process. Furthermore, there's every reason to believe, let me just skip over that. Anyway, debt problems on this scale have no precedent. Overcoming this global crisis is a major challenge for the Paris Club process. This brings me to the heart of today's webinar, China. China is the largest single official creditor to a number of the defaulting low-income countries, and in aggregate has more debt claims on low-income countries than the United States or any other Paris Club member country. But China is not a member of the Paris Club. So this could lead, theoretically, to a situation where countries benefiting from Paris Club debt relief, debt write-offs, are continuing to make principal and interest payments on their debts to China, which would hardly be acceptable to the Paris Club members. They don't want to be bailing out China. I will finish my introductory remarks by presenting my list of 12 essential facts about this issue. Number one, the Paris Club is a process, not a legal entity. Two, the Paris Club emerged in 1956 to deal with a default by Argentina on debt owed to export credit agencies in the United States and so-called industrial countries. Three, it's called the Paris Club because it meets in Paris, hosted by the French Finance Ministry. Four, the Paris Club, which had only industrial country members until a few years ago, now has a total of 22 members, including Brazil and Korea. Five, the Paris Club operates with 6 principles. You can see these on the Paris Club website. Solidarity. This means that the members act as a single entity in negotiations with debtor countries. Consensus. This means the decisions of the Paris Club require the agreement of all members, the terms that they settle on at the end. Information sharing. This means that members of the Paris Club must disclose their claims on debtor countries to each other and to the IMF and the World Bank, but on a confidential basis. Case by case. This means that each debtor country seeking relief is treated individually, as we mentioned before. Conditionality. This is a prerequisite. There is a prerequisite for a country seeking debt relief in the form of a financing arrangement with the IMF that will restore the country's creditworthiness. And the amount of Paris Club relief will be based on the associated financing gap identified by the IMF for this arrangement. Comparability of treatment. This means that debtor countries benefiting from Paris Club debt relief should not accept from non-Paris Club official lenders or private sector commercial lenders any terms of relief that are less favorable than the Paris Club terms. In other words, these non-Paris Club creditors shouldn't get get better payment, get more money from the debtor country. So number 6 essential fact, while China is not a member of the Paris Club, it has the status of an ad hoc participant. This means that there is a Chinese representative who attends Paris Club negotiations with countries having significant debt owed to China. But this representative does not participate in the deliberations of member countries on the specific debt relief terms to be offered. Number 7, China has provided debt relief, including debt reduction, to foreign countries on more than 100 occasions, independently of the Paris Club. It has done so bilaterally while providing little information about the terms of its debt relief. 8, because China does not publish its debt claims on foreign countries as most Paris Club members do, it is not easy to know the size of its claims on developing countries as a whole or on individual countries. 9, perhaps the best source of information on debt owed to China by foreign countries is a data set produced by the World Bank on the foreign debts of 73 low-income countries. This data set shows that the total foreign debt of this group of countries at the end of 2019 was around 520 billion, of which 100 billion, roughly 20%, was owed to China. Furthermore, the total principal and interest payments on this foreign debt owed by these countries in 2020 amounted to about $50 billion, of which 12 billion, roughly 25%, was owed to China. Number 10, China is a member of the G20 Global Forum of Leading Countries. A year ago, because the COVID-19 pandemic was creating debt servicing problems for many countries, the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors, in collaboration with the Paris Club, agreed to a 6-month payment moratorium on debts owed to them by these 73 countries. The moratorium was subsequently extended to the end of this year, to the end of 2021. Last November, the G20 ministers and governors also announced a common framework for long-term restructuring of unsustainable debt due to the pandemic or related problems. Again, in collaboration with the Paris Club. The common framework is closely aligned with the principles of the Paris Club. Finally, because China is a member of the G20, it is now bound in some manner under the common framework to providing debt relief to this group of 73 low-income countries, and possibly to other countries on terms similar to those likely to emerge from Paris Club negotiations. So those are 12 what I call essential facts. The rest is speculation. Although there's some relatively new information here too. So a month ago, I wasn't sure whether negotiations under the common framework would take place in Paris, led by the Paris Club Secretariat, or in some other fashion. We now know that because there has been a first creditor committee meeting for the country of Chad, which has requested debt relief under the Paris framework. And this meeting was held in Riyadh. Saudi Arabia chairs the G20, and this meeting was co-chaired by Saudi Arabia and a representative of the French Finance Ministry, which is in effect the Paris Club. And we don't know what debt restructuring terms emerged from this discussion. That has not been reported or revealed, or at least not that I saw. So that's a little bit unclear. But the IMF also recently reported that there are 2 other countries that have requested debt treatment under the common framework. Those are Ethiopia and Zambia. So just to conclude, while China seems bound to disclose to other participating creditor countries all of its claims on the countries that request relief under the common framework, we don't know if China will disclose all of its claims publicly. In other words, to the Paris Club Secretariat, to the IMF, the World Bank, yes, they will know. But whether there'll be more disclosure for the public, it remains to be seen. And of course, we don't know within the common framework process whether the representative from China will press for more favorable or less favorable terms than the Paris Club members who are participating in these individual negotiations. Well, look, you've heard enough from me to start the discussion, I think. So Scott Morris, please, Scott, lead us into the more interesting part of this webinar, please.
Thank you, Lex. That was very interesting. It's a fascinating presentation. And I think the 12 facts that you just presented will give us some groundwork or some parameter in terms of understanding the relationship between China and Paris Club. And I'm sure the audience, just like me, have more questions to follow up. And there are the devils are always with the details. But before we go into the discussion, let's turn to Scott. For Scott, your observation about this evolving relationship and whether the Paris Club's more recent debt relief discussion has actually favored China as a creditor, or has benefited China as a creditor, or what is the evolving relationship as we look into the future, if you have a crystal ball? Thank you, Scott. The screen is yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Jan. I appreciate the opportunity to speak, and thank you, Lex, for really a great paper. Just and as you described it, is fact forward and less on speculation. And for a topic that is, has a, particularly right now, a geostrategic overlay, which lends itself to a lot of speculation. Really important to have such a clearly articulated paper as what you've done here. So I appreciate that. Lex started with a bit of history, so let me add my own historical reference point. And it is this, in the way of an interesting set of facts, is that it was 25 years ago that the U.S. government, along with the other G7 countries, led on what was really the most recent multi-country, multi-low-income country debt relief initiative. And at that time, it was for 38 low-income countries, called the Heavily Indebted Poor Country Initiative. What is striking in looking back at that initiative then is that the U.S. led for good reasons. Is that the U.S. was among the leading official creditors in the world to these low-income country governments. So when it came to debt relief, the U.S. government had significant debt to relieve. Little noticed at the time is that Costa Rica was a bigger creditor than China to these countries. So we look at the picture today. The U.S. is not a leading creditor to low-income country governments. To some degree, I would argue that was the reaction to the need to do large-scale debt relief in the past, that we became much more sensitive to debt risk, and therefore, as a government, we did a lot less lending, particularly into these vulnerable environments. And then, as Lex already laid out and lays out in more detail in his paper, China today, of course, is the leading official bilateral creditor. And I think it's worth emphasizing this point. It's not just that China is bigger than any one of the Paris Club members, it is bigger than all of the Paris Club members combined. And recognizing that, the disparity there in overall debt stock and the level of lending, particularly in the last decade, that fundamentally affects the dynamics of how the Paris Club operates going forward, what China's position is vis-a-vis the Paris Club. We simply have to start by recognizing China is in an entirely different category of official creditors compared to any other bilateral government creditor. Now, it actually, the better comparison when it comes to scale of financing is an institution like the World Bank. But of course, there are a different set of behaviors and norms attached to the multilateral institutions, and we can talk more about that. And again, I think everything I say here, is covered or anticipated in Lex's paper. So, he does describe the role of the multilaterals in this as well. I want to take a few minutes, and you're giving me a platform, so I can't not take advantage of it, in pointing to some recent work we just released and a new report called How China Lends. You can find it at the Center for Global Development website, as well as the websites of our collaborators. But just very briefly, this was a very significant research project in collaboration with colleagues at Aid Data, William and Mary College, Georgetown Law School, and the Kiel Institute in Germany, where we were able to look at the content of 100 Chinese debt contracts. So the underlying legal text for lending from Chinese state-owned lenders, mostly China Exim Bank and China Development Bank, and developing country governments. And it's particularly, I'll be very quick, but it's particularly useful, I think, to identify the findings of what we saw in those contracts, because all of them that we highlight have implications for the issues that Lex addresses in terms of the Paris Club going forward. So let me just highlight 4 areas very briefly. One is that when it comes to the Chinese contracts compared to other official creditors, there's an unusual degree of confidentiality and non-disclosure requirements imposed on the borrowing country government, including the existence of the loan itself is bound by non-disclosure. that puts, among other things, it certainly puts the borrowing country government in a bind when it comes to the kinds of commitments it makes in the context of a Paris Club treatment. The need to disclose your data, who are your creditors and how much. And yet, we have these contracts that say thou shalt not disclose. You have a striking degree in the use of formal and informal collateral. Again, Lex talks about this in his paper, but the uses of escrow accounts, offshore accounts that are controlled by the Chinese lender that give that lender ready access to liquid, to cash, not necessarily physical asset collateral, which has been in the news when it comes to Chinese lending, but more importantly, this ready access to payments, particularly in situations where the borrower is facing some kind of vulnerabilities and goes to its creditors, typically goes to the Paris Club and says, I need some kind of debt treatment, I can't pay. What we see in these contracts is that the Chinese lenders have positioned themselves to have more senior status effectively through the use of these kinds of accounts. And that, at the very least, is a complicating factor when we consider how might these Chinese lenders act in cooperation with other creditors, certainly with the Paris Club. That is a tension with a cooperative stance, is the extensive use of these kinds of special cash accounts. And then, perhaps the most striking feature that we saw in the Chinese contracts that goes, directly counter to any hope for cooperation with the Paris Club is very explicit language that says we will not cooperate with the Paris Club. I mean, almost to the word. We call it the No Paris Club clause. More specifically, what it says, it is a message to the borrowing country, a contractual message that says, if you go to the Paris Club for treatment, or frankly, if you go to any other creditors, a group of creditors for some kind of debt treatment, we will not be bound by whatever you receive. And again, that is a direct rejection of the Paris Club's own core principle of comparable treatment. So that's a striking feature. Really is something that would need to be addressed going forward if we are going to have any reconciliation here. And then finally, and this is in the context of our discussion today, this is a lesser element, but there are sort of a host of measures that are what we describe as essentially policy levers that the Chinese lenders can employ. They are sort of fairly muscular features that allow for cancellation of the loan or to call the loan early through a range of triggers that can be policy triggers, behavior in the borrowing country or in China as well. And it's worth mentioning that in this context because it goes to the issue of what do we mean by official lender? And this has been a point of contention in the context of the G20 Common Framework discussions that by self-declaration, the Chinese government has said, yes, China Exim Bank is a policy bank. It is an arm of the Chinese government, and those credits are official credits, and they will be treated as official credits in the Common Framework. But China Development Bank is a commercial lender, and therefore, we should think of it as Citibank. We should not think of it as any other government lender. And therefore is in a separate category. Again, in the context of this research, what we observed is in China Development Bank contracts, you have contractual features where it is very clear that the CDB is a policy lever. It has cancellation clauses that are tied directly to policy, again, on the borrowing country and the Chinese government creditor side. So I think it is, on its face, in my mind, it has always been contestable and questionable that we would consider CDB a purely commercial lender, clearly owned by the state, but and has been identified historically as a policy bank. And this is just additional evidence as to how it behaves as a policy bank. Let me just make a few additional comments, that came to my mind in reading Lex's paper. And again, I'll start with this particular issue, is that I think as we think about the longstanding norms and behavior of the Paris Club and how they might translate or transfer over to a G20 arrangement in the name of the common framework, this question of definitions matters a lot. What is an official creditor? And while I think the case against the Chinese case for China Development Bank is quite straightforward and ought to be, frankly, if I were articulating US policy, I would be pushing hard on this issue of CDB status. The fact is you have a broader array of wholly state-owned lenders that we generally describe as being commercial lenders for China. And not to mention, not just China, but there are a lot of other emerging non-Paris Club creditor countries where this kind of lending arrangement, state ownership, but not necessarily a direct arm of the government. How are we to think about these kinds of lenders and their credits? Should they count as official credits, or should they be viewed as commercial credits? And we can talk more about the implications of that. Another issue, and one that Lex mentioned, is the question of country coverage when it comes to debt treatments. And as much as people, and I would count myself among them, that view the common framework as a step forward, particularly in China's participation, it is limited in a number of ways. And one of the ways in which it's limited is the applicability of countries. And namely, it was by design only capturing low-income countries, 72 or so, and not capturing many other developing countries, particularly countries that themselves are having significant debt vulnerabilities now. So as a result, there really is no architecture outside of the Paris Club for addressing these countries where, among them will be countries where China is the dominant creditor, or certainly the leading or a leading creditor. So it leaves entirely unresolved what cooperation might look like in those country cases. There are a set of issues that Lex addresses that are really very interesting, that are a bit more speculative as to what are China's preferences going forward. We know the Chinese government has chosen not to join the Paris Club, has been under pressure to join the Paris Club, although I would argue in the last 4 years that pressure has eased substantially. I think it was, when it comes to US policy, it was much more of a priority of the Obama administration than it was the Trump administration. But if not, why not? Why does China continue not to choose to join? I would add to the list, and I don't dispute Lex's characterizations here. I would probably add to the list or characterize it as a continued desire to retain maximum flexibility, that in defining the terms of debt relief, the choice of debt relief or debt restructuring, entirely within its own framework and system, and not to be bound or directed by an external arrangement. I think it's worth dwelling on that a bit, because I guess I remain slightly optimistic, although emphasis on slightly, that for the Chinese government, defining self-interest can evolve over time. And I think perhaps the silver lining of a crisis like the one we are facing now, which is certainly the first crisis of this sort that the Chinese government has faced in the role of being a leading creditor, is you see the value of cooperation more clearly. It becomes, frankly, just even a practical sense, much more difficult to manage the requests for some form of debt relief across not just one country, two country, a handful, but 10, 20, 30, 40. And of course, the very origins of the Paris Club, and were based on a recognition among these leading creditors that it would be in their self-interest to cooperate with each other. And I think I will leave with my own question and not try to answer, but perhaps for discussion is, we are left at this moment with a pretty fundamental question: is there a Paris Club going forward? What is the role for the Paris Club? Is the common framework the new Paris Club? What does it need to achieve in additional articulation or experience where we can declare that it in effect, or even de jure somehow, it is the new official creditor organizing platform for these things. Because I think what is clear is that we no longer have a world where the Paris Club is the leading actor on behalf of bilateral creditors. For this, this goes back to the simple factual issue, is that it doesn't even constitute a majority of official bilateral credits of the world. One other government does, and that is China. So, we are no longer in a world where the status quo can hold, and it does need to evolve towards something that seems to be happening, perhaps in incremental steps in the G20 process. And I think it's well worth watching this unfold in the months and years ahead very closely. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Scott. That's really, really interesting, and it's so informative. I definitely will jump on the report that you just CDB just released about how China lends, and this no Paris Club clause sounds particularly disturbing moving forward with in terms of China's relationship with Paris Club, and you have given us, I'm sorry to say, more or less a kind of a gloomy picture. It seems that China holds a lot of leverage, and the Paris Club and the borrowing countries do not necessarily have the weight or the leverage to counterbalance what China is trying to do. So I want to turn back to Lex and just ask for your reaction about the reality or the picture that Scott just painted us, which is that Paris Club used to be probably more dominant and more significant a player on the international finance, development finance scenery, but now it seems that Paris Club's importance or its simple share of the pie is diminishing. So when we talk about China's relationship with Paris Club, what is the implication of that? That should we craft a different strategy to deal with China alone as a standalone actor? Or you think that this collective or the multilateralism still has its important roles to play?
So what I would ask everybody to do is sort of take a step back and sort of look at this thing from the moon, and basically there is a fundamental choice, or there's a fundamental difference, first of all, between creditors and debtors. If you're a creditor country, you have one set of interests. If you're a debtor country, you have a different set of interests. And one of the things that's going on here is that China, sort of in a very relatively short period of time, has gone from a sort of a debtor country to the biggest creditor country. And so this is confusing. It's a process that if you're in the policy making part of a government, making the shift from a debtor orientation to a creditor orientation is not really easy to do. When you're in the creditor environment, you then have this really fundamental question of how do you do debt restructuring? First of all, you're not going to avoid it. We're never going to live in a world without debt restructuring, because it's just in the nature of the process. Loans are made and some of them are not repaid, and so the big choice is between an institution, a debt restructuring institution like the one that Anne Kruger tried to propose 20 years ago, or an ad hoc approach. And what I would say is that And I was saying this 15 years ago. China may not be in the Paris Club now, but as a creditor and as its creditor interests become more and more clear, it will iterate toward the Paris Club principles. The Paris Club principles have, I would say, nothing to do with the individual Paris Club countries, or little to do with the Paris Club countries, and everything to do with being a creditor country that doesn't want to see its money just wasted and go down the drain. That wants to have sort of a decent process for dealing with distress debt, and that leads you straight to the 6 principles of the Paris Club, I'd say. So let me stop. I could go on for hours, but I think that the simple point here is that I don't care what you call it. I believe that we will move into a process that is Paris Club-like, that applies the 6 principles, and the only real issue that is going to arise is whether it becomes institutionalized into something like the sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, or continues to be sort of ad hoc. It's to me, you can have a Paris Club, you can have this common framework operate for the next 20 years, 30 years. And I don't think, it can be chaired, it can be co-chaired by a G20, whatever country is chairing the G20, and co-chaired with the French finance minister, or at some point co-chaired with China, as they get more creditor oriented in their view of these things. But so to me, it's not a it's not a problem like the global like the climate change problem. To me, it's a sort of fairly straightforward. And the other thing I won't get into, but which is fascinating, is the bankruptcy process, because we have domestic bankruptcy process, and so there are people who've been arguing for decades, why don't we have an international bankruptcy process? And basically my book tries to explain why that doesn't make sense. But so I seems to me, whether you call it the Paris Club or the China Club or the G20 Club, there's going to be debt restructuring that follows pretty much the same principles. And the other interesting aspect of this is another big question about this is the relationship with the IMF, because here again you have a situation where China is such an important country, but China doesn't have the vote in the IMF that is commensurate with its role in the world economy.
Well, thank you, Lex, for that true globalist perspective, that whoever solves the problem, as long as the problem gets solved, it doesn't really matter. I hope the Chinese government will think just like what you just described, but in reality, I think they're a little bit more nationalistic or less altruistic than we would like to see. And I think Scott made the point really, really well, that China is trying to maintain maximum flexibility, and such maximum flexibility is not necessarily always in the interest of the borrowers and of other lenders. So we'll move rapidly into the Q&A section, and the first question was posed relatively early in our session, and it's about the defaults among China's international debtors. That are these defaults or these debt stress causing systematic problems internal for China? And I would add to that question that as we see more and more debt restructuring between China and the borrowers, is this sustainable? That even if it does not cause a major internal, say, banking crisis in China, is that going to create a crisis or a shortage of funding or a shortage of the will to continue such massive lending for China externally? Is this something that you have observed? Lex, you want to go first?
Well, I don't work on this day to day the way other people do. I'm not. I don't have I don't really have my arms around the problem, to be honest. But I thought I saw a figure that said that showed that China's lending dropped substantially from in 2020, for example, from the level 2 years before that. So look, they yes, flexibility, I think, is a principle, is a sort of an approach that they will stick to for some time. I can't imagine them sort of abandoning that way of doing business. But I don't know enough about China's domestic economy and international lending policies to really have a useful view on how this is going to play out in the future for China.
Thank you, Lex. Well, we do recall that I think it was Boston University that released their data, and actually a database, I think somewhere last year, that declared that while China's lending along BRI or overall foreign lending has dropped significantly. Scott, I'm sure you've been following this quite closely. Any impression or any comments? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. One, when, if we look at the overseas lending in relation to the Chinese economy, to leverage in the Chinese economy, it doesn't strike me as a leading vulnerability, even at the massive scale. Our comparators in thinking about China cross-border lending are other official lenders. But in relation to the Chinese economy, I don't think this lending by itself has created huge vulnerabilities for the Chinese system. That said, as you just said, we can also observe there has been retrenchment. The lending has fallen off before the crisis, in fact, before the pandemic. And I think emerging from this crisis, and particularly whatever this round of debt treatments looks like, that will have some effect, even in the policy and approaches of these lenders, that there will be, as there was, frankly, with the leading HIPC creditor countries, some degree of sort of a redesign of the basic approach. So more sensitivity to debt risk. And of course, we have heard that from Chinese officials in just the last few years. They put forward a debt sustainability framework for the Belt and Road Initiative. At least the finance ministry officials have been fairly aggressive in speaking to the need to introduce new measures to guard against debt vulnerabilities. So I think that ought to have some real effect on lending behavior going forward.
Thank you, Scott. And what you just said, I think really touches upon or addresses the second question, which is about the internal dynamics in China among different agencies about the multilateral engagement on debt issues, such as among Ministry of Finance and People's Bank of China. That just to add on to what you just said, which is so insightful, my understanding is that a lot of the Chinese banks are actually, for example, Exim and CDB are okay with debt restructuring, because once the debt is restructured, it no longer appears as a problem or as a loss on their books. But to do that, they actually need to obtain the approval from the Ministry of Finance and also People's Bank of China, because they are eventually the ones who are actually writing off the debt. So there are certain discrepancies among the Chinese lenders and the Chinese government. So that's I think that's the issue that probably deserves a lot of interesting deliberation moving forward. Next question is about debt trap, and of course, the debt trap narrative has been repeatedly deliberated in multiple cases. But Scott, what you just mentioned about the different clauses, the confidentiality, no Paris Club, different clauses that the Chinese lenders have embedded in the contracts, that does seems to be depleting the borrower from other alternatives and bogging the borrowers down in a relatively exclusive arrangement. And that does suggest intentionality on China's part. So I wonder whether we could turn to you first on this debt trap issue. What's your take? That it does seems to be quite intentional, at least based on the contracts that you've studied.
Sure. We can end up debating semantics. What do we mean by a trap? And I think in a lot of popular characterizations of this issue, I tend to think it's almost a distraction from the reality. And namely, particularly the argument that Chinese lenders, the Chinese government ultimately is deliberately lending into debt distress in order to obtain other things. For a number of reasons, that doesn't strike me as very plausible as a general proposition. But again, I think that's a distraction from, as what we observed in these contracts. Do the Chinese lenders behave in ways that are insensitive to the risks in a lot of these situations that are, as we describe it, muscular in their approach as a creditor? And I think if the provisions we looked at are mostly various efforts at ensuring repayment, and particularly aggressive efforts at ensuring repayment. And that's understandable from the creditor's perspective. It's not terribly sympathetic or sensitive to what I would look at it broadly as a development agenda, what the Chinese might call a South-South agenda, because the lenders are clearly looking to protect themselves first and foremost in situations where the borrowing government might be in trouble. And of course, those are the very situations where there are a lot of things at stake. It's not just repayment to a class of creditors or a single creditor. It is the very development progress in a country where a debt crisis can constitute a setback in human progress in that country, measured in decades. So I think what we need to see, particularly when we're talking about government creditors, is what I would argue is just a more responsible approach, and not one where they are acting strictly as commercial creditors and demand to be repaid at all costs.
Thank you, Scott. Lex, you have a quick comment to make?
Yeah, my comment is that I wouldn't put too much weight on the terms of these Chinese contracts, because flexibility means that they don't have to enforce any of these terms, and they don't want to come out of these situations as the bad guy. So it seems to me they will flex in the way as needed. But also, there's a counterpart with the bond restructuring process, because we had these bond contracts that made it very difficult to get involved in restructuring operations, and so they started rewriting the contracts and to make it easier to restructure in a default case, country default. And I think the same thing is going to happen. Because the ultimate problem is that the creditor country is not going to be paid. We're not going to send the army in to collect, as we did 150 years ago. We're not going to send the Marines in to collect the debt on these countries. China's not going to do that, I don't think, any more than the US is going to do that. So, the question is, what do they have to do to get paid something, which is better than getting paid nothing?
That is a great point. I think with the approach, the preferred approach seems to be kicking the can down the road, and hopefully they will get something back in the end. But Lex, here's a comment from your old colleague Tom Byrne, and this about the multilateral lenders. That we talked about bilateral lenders, and Paris Club collectively do not constitute a bigger lender than China has become. But the World Bank and IMF are still dominant creditors in terms of the whole lending or the borrowing picture. So Tom's questions are: one, could World Bank and IMF get China to play the role of a responsible creditor and follow Paris Club principles, even if China is not a former member of the club? And And has China suspended debt service payments owed to them in the DSSI? I think the second one we know the answer, that it has suspended payment till the end of 2020, and there's an extension of that. But it's not a cancellation, and it's not it's only a suspension. So I think the first question to you, Lex, is can World Bank and the IMF do anything?
Look, the World Bank and the IMF have long and deep experience with the Paris Club, and so they understand the Paris Club principles as well as the Paris Club Secretariat does, I would say, or any member does. And I think they understand. I mean, they've tried alternatives. There've been pressures within the World Bank. There've been pressures within the IMF to come up with institutionalized debt restructuring mechanisms, and I don't see any appetite in those institutions right now to go to that route. So I can imagine, my best guess is that both IMF and World Bank will be trying to help China understand that it's in China's own interest to do debt restructuring using the Paris Club principles, although it's the principles that are important, not the name Paris Club.
Scott, wondering whether you have anything to add on that front? Multilateral lenders might have some influence over China's behavior.
Yeah, maybe just to observe. I give these institutions some credit in recent months for being fairly aggressive on this issue, even to a degree that is perhaps not entirely diplomatic. And we, calling out the Chinese government by name. But I would say more generally, what I'm encouraged by with that experience is not so much that they're getting tough on China, but frankly that they are flexing their own muscles a bit when it comes to official creditors. Because I think it's for a long time we've had this world where, well, the Paris Club is doing its thing among bilateral creditors and is generally doing the right thing, and as a result, this government lending activity has kind of gotten a pass. The bank and the fund spend most of their time preaching to the borrowing countries, either preaching or actually hard conditionality on their own lending. They don't spend a lot of time telling creditors how to behave. And I think that's what's changed a bit recently. And just to give you an example that this extends well beyond China, as much as all this, the confidentiality we observe in these contracts, particularly aggressive with the Chinese, the reality is when it comes to government lending, this is a notoriously opaque activity. US Exim Bank does not post its debt contracts on its website. Maybe there's nothing there to see, fine, but why not be proactive about that? So I think the multilaterals actually could define more of an agenda here that makes it a bit uncomfortable for their leading shareholding countries, but I think importantly so.
Well said, well said. The multilaterals are not necessarily interfering or imposing any of their standard, and it's hard for them to do too. So we're going to wrap up relatively soon. So one last question for the two of you respectively. To Lex, the question is, in what ways would you like to see the global bankruptcy process to be different from an ad hoc or institutionalized Paris Club or common framework? Because you were talking about the global bankruptcy process, I think this question will be right in your alley. And the question for Scott, I know is something that you have worked substantially on as well, and it's about AIIB. And I still remember the event that we did last year about AIIB, which was very interesting. So the question is, how does the lack of transparency in Chinese bilateral lending relate to China's leadership of the AIIB? And would AIIB have visibility into the indebtedness of potential borrowers that ADB or World Bank do not? Would love to get your insights on those two questions related to AIIB. So Lex, would you give us your thoughts about the global bankruptcy process first? Thank you.
Yeah, I tried back in 2002, 2003 to to think about the process in terms of global interests, not in terms of narrow creditor interests, or no, in terms of humanity, if you will. And I basically decided that an ad hoc approach is the most sensible approach, as long as it's working. And it seems to me it is working. And so you get this idea: if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So I would say I see no reason to spend significant amounts of time trying to create a new mechanism. That, it's not an easy process. It's not a quick process. It doesn't always lead to perfect results, but it's also important to understand it's a political process. Sovereign debt restructuring is a political process. And this is a big distinction from domestic bankruptcy, from some corporate, business bankruptcies, which are designed to take all of the politics out of it. But you can't take the politics out of international lending and debt restructuring. And I think as long as we don't have a world government that can adopt the bankruptcy law for the whole world, the ad hoc approach is better.
Thank you, Lex. How about AIIB, China's great invention, Scott?
Yeah, sure. I think the premise of your question is also the reason I've taken a special interest in the AIIB, is that as a general proposition, I think the more multilateralism from China, the better. And if we could get Chinese lending generally to act more like World Bank lending, or pick your MDB, the better. So I think that's sort of the promise of the AIIB, is that it very much is modeled on and sees its peers as the other MDBs. It doesn't necessarily see its peers as China Development Bank or China Exim. I think the question is, will it have an effect within the Chinese system, and particularly on those particular institutions? And I think that remains to be seen. It is, in financing terms, a much smaller actor than those. On the other hand, it has been a huge diplomatic success for the Chinese government. And I think as a result, it has an opportunity to affect some change within the system. I think for countries like the U.S., particularly the U.S., which is outside of the AIIB, it's important to look for opportunities for cooperation, because I think that it can be that kind of platform for putting forward better lending practice.
Well, at least we hope so. At least we hope that it will introduce some good practice or some good insights into the Chinese system, which is relatively difficult to change from the outside. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you for sharing your insights and sharing your observation, and for sharing with us your either the pessimism or optimism about the future of the global debt issue and China's relationship with Paris Club. I recommend all of our audience to read the two papers that we talked about today: Lex paper about China's relationship with Paris Club, and the CDB's paper about how China does its lending. Based on the conversation today, I think everyone is as convinced as I am that these two papers offer important insights that will help us to understand how China really engages the global community on the issue of international development finance and the debt issue. So with that, we successfully conclude today's session. I'm sure this conversation will continue, and look forward to more insightful analysis and also studies from both Lex and from Scott's and your team. Thank you so much for joining today.